What's going on, everyone? I'm just a typical, average American here today to react and continue learning about how Norway is becoming the world's richest country. Part 3. If you haven't seen Part 1 or Part 2, feel free to go check those out first, or stay here in Part 3. That's perfectly fine as well. But in Part 1, we learned about how Norway first became kind of rich by selling wood, and in part 2, we learned about how Norway became rich, like with hydroelectricity, and then by luck and good fortune, Norway got a lot of oil and has done very, very, very well with the oil. And now, in part 3, I'm very excited to continue learning about how now in the modern day, Norway is continuing to expand its wealth and may just become the richest country in the entire world, even richer than the United States. And I'm very, very interested to see how that is possible, what exactly Norway is doing. So with that being said, let's take a look.
And as it turned out, there actually was a lot of oil and gas on the Norwegian continental shelf.
Yeah.
So much so that Norway now has the largest reserves of oil in Europe outside of Russia. And
Wow. See, I didn't know that. I knew Norway had a lot of oil, and that Norway has done very, 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 very well with the oil. But it actually, right now, out of all of Europe, it has the second most oil reserves in barrels, 8 billion barrels.
is ranked 20th in the world, with
Wow.
similar volumes as former OPEC countries Angola and Ecuador, and with more than 3 times as many reserves as the next place in Europe just across the North Sea,
Wow.
the UK. And in terms of natural gas, Norway again is ranked as having the largest reserves in Europe outside of Russia,
What?
and the 21st largest in the world, with
What?
volumes that are similar to the likes of Kuwait and Azerbaijan.
I mean, it's just so impressive. Like, Norway is not a huge country. Norway doesn't have a huge population, actually. But somehow Norway is continually one of the top countries in wealth, and now in oil and gas reserves as well. The size of Norway just does not matter. Norway is going to do what Norway wants to do.
And with its extremely close proximity to the European Union's market, Norway had a ready-to-go export market all lined up for itself as well. With hardly any oil and gas resources of their own beyond the Groningen gas field in the Netherlands, the EU has practically always had to import the vast majority of the oil and gas they consume from abroad.
Yeah,
Oil was a
yeah.
far easier problem.
Yeah. Now, you know what? I'm curious now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict going on, a lot of European countries aren't buying oil from Russia anymore. Isn't that right? So Norway, a lot of European countries are probably relying on Norway even more so during this time to meet that oil demand instead of Russia, I imagine, when I think about that. Yeah, that's probably true, right?
For the EU to solve, though, because oil can effectively be imported from anywhere else in the world. The bloc was less handicapped by geography here because, in its crude form, oil is a liquid that can be easily loaded up into barrels or containers and shipped across the oceans on container ships from origin to destination.
Okay.
Meaning that the EU could easily import oil from as far away as the Americas and Nigeria with little worries.
Right.
But natural gas was a completely different problem for the Europeans to solve.
So oil, it turns out you can probably buy your oil, like, internationally if you have to. You can buy oil from basically anywhere in the world, so that's not such a huge issue. But natural gas, since Norway is a leading, like, holder of natural gas, that sounds like that's a lot harder to actually move around. So maybe Europe is relying on Norway more for natural gas than oil, actually.
Gas is far more difficult and expensive to export and move around the world than oil because, well,
Okay.
it's a
Okay.
gas.
Okay.
While it's in its gaseous state, it takes up a huge amount of volume and is completely economically impractical to load up on a container vessels and ship somewhere else.
Okay.
Thus, before the rise of liquefied natural gas production, gas markets were highly geographically regional in nature. For Europe, this meant building out a series of pipelines to transport natural gas from relatively nearby sources to consumers.
Wow.
The largest of which, during the 20th and early 21st centuries, were constructed from the relatively nearby gas sources in the Netherlands, Algeria, the Soviet and later Russian Siberian fields from Azerbaijan after the
Oh my god, I had no idea this is how this worked. They literally have like a gas pipeline? Maybe I have heard of this. This is just something I've never really thought about before. Now that I say it out loud, like gas pipelines, those do exist. I didn't know there were so many. And they literally span all over Europe, all the way to Norway as well, to everywhere else. Yeah.
collapse of the Soviet Union, and of course from Norway and the Norwegian continental shelf.
Yeah.
This historically made the EU mostly dependent upon natural gas imports from three of its closest and largest neighbors: Russia, Norway, and Algeria.
Wow, okay.
By 2021, Norway had constructed a total of 11 undersea gas pipelines connecting their gas resources directly to European consumers.
Wow.
And then in 2010, Norwegian gas production exceeded the country's oil production for the very first time, as
Oh, okay, so this is new to me. See, I've heard about Norwegian oil, and that being a big contributor to Norway's wealth. I don't know anything about natural gas. Apparently, that's just as important as the oil for Norway. Actually, the natural gas exceeded the oil here, they were just saying.
the demand in the EU and the UK continued growing for more. And by the 2010s, Norway had already emerged as the second largest exporter of natural gas to the EU, only behind the Russians.
Wow.
By 2021,
Yeah. So, yeah, this is exactly what I thought. Like, I don't know how much European countries are cooperating with Russia right now. So, if there are European countries not buying natural gas or oil from Russia, Norway was number 2. So maybe Norway is just number 1 right now. And a lot of Europe is relying on Norway to get their natural gas and oil. I think that's reasonable to assume, right? That's probably happening.
the year immediately before Russia launched its full-scale invasion into Ukraine, Russia was supplying about 40% of the EU's total gas imports, while Norway was supplying about another 25% of them. While
Okay.
Russia was further supplying the EU with about 25% of their oil imports, up against Norway's share of 9.4% of their oil imports.
Okay.
And by this point, with billions of dollars a year gushing into the Norwegian economy, Norway had already effectively become a petrostate, the only
Yeah.
one in Europe other than Russia. In 2021, oil and gas made up roughly 21% of the entire Norwegian GDP, and
Wow. All of 20% of Norway's economy, GDP, wealth, 20%, 1 out of every $5 or kroner in Norway is because of the oil and gas industry there. That's amazing.
made up a whopping 51% of all of Norway's exports by value.
Wow.
But Norway never actually evolved
Wow.
into the usual petrostate stereotypes of corruption and authoritarianism
Oh.
for several notable reasons that set it notably apart from the others. While there is no
Really?
universally
Really? Wait. I wanna stop. I wanna acknowledge that. That's really interesting. Norway became very wealthy and powerful because of gas and oil, but Norway did not become corrupted by it. Apparently that's normal to become corrupted by the power and the wealth of the oil industry, but Norway has resisted that. That's a nice little addition they kept in there. I think that's very important.
agreed upon definition of what actually constitutes a petrostate. The most general definitions revolve around countries whose economies are very heavily dependent upon the extractions and exporting of oil and gas to the point where without those industries, their economies could face collapse.
Isn't that Norway? Wouldn't Norway's economy be in a lot of trouble? 50%. They said 50% of what Norway exports is oil and gas. That's 50% of the economy, right? It's pretty important to Norway.
25 countries around the world spanning South America, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia usually come to mind as the world's most classic examples of petrostates.
Okay.
And out of all 25 of them, every single one are considered by the Economist Democracy Index to be either authoritarian regimes or hybrid regimes, except for only 2 of them.
Wow.
Indonesia and Norway.
Wow, that is what they meant. Literally, 25 of the top oil petrol states in the world, petrol nations, are like authoritarian governments. And Norway is one of 2 that is like more of a representative government, democracy, voting, prime minister, that sort of thing. Good for Norway. Wow. That's very cool.
But Norway stands out above all of the rest, ahead of even Indonesia, because the same index from The Economist literally ranks Norway as the single most democratic, free, and egalitarian society on the face of the earth.
Wait,
which
what?
puts its status as a petrostate into an extremely stark contrast with a
I didn't know that. Wow, this is a really, really interesting video. I'm sure this is all going to come back to why Norway is becoming the world's richest country. This is definitely a contributing factor, but I also think this is just fascinating. Norway is the most democratic country in the world? The world. Most democratic of all countries in the world?
earth, which puts most democratic, free, and egalitarian society on the face of the earth, which puts its status as a petrostate into an extremely stark contrast with the likes of Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, which are all among the most heavily authoritarian and corrupt states in the world.
Yeah.
And a big part of the reason why an abundance of oil and gas resources didn't turn Norway into a heavily authoritarian and corrupt state like most of the other petrostates is because of the country's geography, history, and forward-looking policies that their government enacted from early on.
Right. This is not an accident. Norway has been putting in very careful procedures and precautions to make sure this outcome happened. Norway seems to be very, very forward-looking. And because of Norway's history and culture, Norway just has a culture that facilitates not becoming corrupt jerks, I guess. Norway stays pure. Oh my god. All joking aside, that is really, really admirable. Very cool.
When Norway discovered oil, the country already had a long culture of communal ownership of natural resources going back centuries to the lumber and hydro industries.
Right,
the country
right.
was already wealthy, industrialized, highly developed, and had a stable, functioning democracy where wealth and power were each already highly decentralized. Democratic institutions and communal ownership of resources were already strongly ingrained within the fabric of Norwegian society as a result. Which is an incredibly stark contrast to just about every single other country that discovered enormous oil and gas wells.
Oh, I get it. Now I understand. Norway has a very unique history. Norway, and I didn't know this until I saw part 1 and part 2. I thought Norway became rich from oil. That's not the case. Not true. Norway became wealthy from lumber and wood, then from hydroelectricity. So Norway already knew how to handle wealth. Norway already decentralized power, spread out power, and knew how to take on the responsibility of money and big industries, and Norway could handle it. So when Norway got the oil and became a huge oil and natural gas resource for the world, Norway already kind of knew how to handle that responsibility. This makes so much sense to me. This is such a cool history. So Norway was really set up for success and has continued to do that. Whereas I think they're about to say how most other countries might be poor or like have some kind of authoritarian government. Then they discover oil. They become rich, and it's just corruption and centralized power and stealing wealth and all that, but not Norway. Wow. Wow.
Saudi Arabia discovered its oil wealth when it was ruled by a warlord who had established an absolute monarchy and had already centralized power fully around himself.
Right.
And so the oil wealth only further cemented the monarchy's power.
Right.
Oil was similarly discovered in Iran while the country was ruled by an autocratic monarchy. And the keys to the oil wealth were inherited by the still autocratic Islamic Revolution after 1979. Oil
Okay.
was discovered within Russia during the Tsarist period, and the keys to the oil wealth were inherited by the still autocratic Soviets, and then further inherited by the modern Putinist regime. Oil was discovered in Venezuela
Wow.
during the autocratic military dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez, while the oil industries in Syria, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and all across Africa were basically handed over directly from autocratic European colonial administrations to autocratic dictatorships that immediately or very quickly took over in their place.
Oh my god. Norway, I didn't even realize how unique Norway was. I don't know much about the oil and natural gas industry. Apparently it's very corrupt, and Norway is kind of special and sticks out as like a very, very special country that deals in this industry. That's really interesting to learn about.
Of all the countries to have ever discovered enormous oil and gas wealth, only a handful have ever done so while already being wealthy, politically independent, and with stable traditions of democracy and
Yeah.
low levels of inequality. And
Right.
the only one with a very small population to have ever done so has been Norway.
Yes, Norway. Oh my god. I am so glad it was Norway. Norway was meant to have this power, to have this responsibility and wealth, because Norway can handle it. I think that Norway has the power. I'm glad. I'm actually glad. Like, as an American, I'm glad to. I don't even care that it's another country. I'm glad of all the countries that it's Norway. That's a great outcome.
Norway was thus better prepared to handle the sudden influx of oil and gas wealth than most others have been. But it still initially caused the Norwegian economy to become rapidly undiversified and dependent on oil and gas anyway. Throughout
Right.
the 1970s and early 80s, when the price of oil was high, the oil-dependent Norwegian economy was booming. But then in 1986, the price of oil suddenly collapsed, and with it,
Oh.
Norway's heavily oil-dependent economy suffered its first oil-induced recession. Over the
Oh.
past 6 decades of history, going back to 1960, the Norwegian economy has only ever shrunk on 3 occasions.
Wow.
In 2020, during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, in 2009, during the depths of the Great Financial Crisis, and in 1988, back during the depths of this oil recession.
So Norway's economy has done pretty well. Norway annual GDP growth, although the entire from 1960 to 2020, this whole thing is kind of in a downtrend. But anyway, we're talking about these 3 super long, super downturns. 2 were from like global pandemics and financial crisis. But this one in 1988 was because of oil. So Norway is really dependent on oil and it reflects that in its economy. So if oil prices collapse, Norway is dependent enough on oil that it sends Norway into a recession. But it's only happened one time.
But the Norwegian government learned a valuable lesson from this recession in the 1980s. It needed to diversify itself away from the unpredictable ebbs and flows in the oil market.
Smart.
And so, just a couple years later, in 1990, the Norwegian state, with its long history of communal ownership of resources and democratic institutions, had the foresight and the capability to establish the Pension Fund Global, otherwise known as the so-called Oil Fund.
The oil fund! Finally, the oil fund, the sovereign wealth fund. Yes, yes. Oh my god, Norway is so freaking smart. So, Norway had a recession because they were dependent on oil. And that prompted Norway to create this wealth fund to diversify and invest a lot of their wealth, including the oil money, into a much more diversified portfolio. I don't exactly know what Norway is invested in with its like $1 trillion wealth fund, but that's why the Norwegian oil fund or Norwegian sovereign wealth fund, that's why it exists. I never understood that. Oh my gosh. This is so freaking interesting. I know this is this is a lot more dense than I thought. A lot of history, some finance, economics, but I'm actually fascinated by this. This is a really, really interesting history to me. Stuff about Norway, I had no idea. It's actually a great story. But I think we're going to stop right here for now. We've been going at this for a while. This is turning into kind of a long series, but I think that's okay. This has been pretty enjoyable for me. And I think we're going to try to pick up on this in part 4. Part 4. So if you've enjoyed this so far, feel free to give this video a like or leave a comment with your thoughts on Norway's history, how Norway is becoming the richest country in the world. It's all starting to make sense. And if you're interested in part 4 of this, or if you're interested in more videos in general of me reacting to Norway and learning things about Norway for the first time, feel free to subscribe for more. And until then, thanks for watching, and see you next time.